to this Academy of Ideas special discussion, how can we end the cost of living crisis? I'm Rob Lyons, and as well as being Science and Technology Director at the Academy of Ideas, I'm also the convener of the Academy of Ideas Economy Forum. Well, we're all very familiar now with rising prices and rates of inflation that haven't been seen for decades. Most acutely, those price rises hit energy bills, both domestically and for petrol and diesel. But thanks to those energy price rises and wider problems, it seems like almost everything is getting considerably more expensive. And while prices have taken off, wages have been lagging behind. Indeed, government ministers berate those who want to maintain their living standards by seeking wage rises in line with inflation. For those on fixed incomes, like pensioners, and many on those on benefits, the impact of the inflation and this cost of living crisis has been even worse. So tonight we're going to try to understand why everything is getting more expensive. Are we still dealing with the world economy bouncing back from COVID? How much impact are the war in Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia having? Or has this all been in the pipeline for a long time through easy monetary policies from central banks, stagnant productivity and environmental policies? So there's a lot to figure out. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to say that the Academy of Ideas has made it our mission to provoke thought-provoking debate with the motto, free speech allowed, and with an emphasis on making audience members, not just a panel of experts, central to our style of discussion. If you would like to chip in with the price of a pint, then please do so. My colleague Ella hopefully will be putting the link in the chat, but it's academyofideas.org.uk/support. Right, okay, on to our speakers, and they'll be speaking for 7-10 minutes each, introducing different aspects of what's going on at the moment. And in the order they're speaking, first up is Robert Figg. He's principal at the Metals Risk Team, a commodity risk management consultancy, having previously worked at ArcelorMittal and the London Metals Exchange. Then it's Hilary Salt. She's an actuary and founder of First Actuarial and has worked a great deal with trade unions and will have a different perspective on things as well. And finally, Phil Mullen, who's a writer, lecturer and business manager and author of Beyond Confrontation, Globalists, Nationalists and Their Discontents. So without any further ado, I'm going to hopefully spotlight no, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Oh dear. It's been a while since I've done this. There we go. There's Robert. Right. Okay, over to you, Robert.
Thanks very much, Rob. I really want to situate and sort of set the scene about commodities since the crash of 2008. I want to use that as my starting point, although these kind of changes that we've seen have been going on for a lot longer than that. Volatility in commodity prices, rising and falling as we've seen, is not an issue that is peculiar to one country. It is a global phenomenon at the moment. It predates Ukraine, it predates COVID and the green agenda or the fossil fuel issue. Certainly the crash of 2008 led to a significant fall in investment in commodities. Initially, it was in response to falling demand, but exacerbated latterly by country risk and the rise of resource nationalism, putting a brake on investment in many African and Latin American countries, most notably Peru, Chile, Bolivia, in Africa, South Africa, Zambia, DRC, and others, where investment really dried up from the major mining companies. Building a new mine is a long-term prospect with lots of risks attached to it. Normally, it takes about 10 years to develop a mine from inception to production, and there's a significant period following that of payback. So mining companies have been rather loath to invest in economies where their investments are unstable and the returns are not guaranteed. What many of the big mining companies did was to try and drive down the cost of production, which they have been pretty successful at, but they've also deployed unused cash that they have in highly unproductive ways to fund high dividend payments and buybacking of shares rather than investing in new productive fields. For example, Rio Tinto's latest dividend yield was 12% of your investment, and that is echoed across the entire commodities world. Very little new investment has occurred in difficult jurisdictions. In fact, they've been selling them off, and that has continued to add to what we call supply side shortages, the shortages of metal and other commodities. Western Europe, as we're all aware, have been very heavily reliant on Russia for supplies of fossil fuel materials such as oil, gas, and concomitantly electricity, but also on mining and agricultural products. Copper, nickel, two key metals in the battery industry, and agricultural commodities, most notably wheat. The world economy also relies very heavily on China as an offtake of raw materials. And that too has been hit by not only the world economy, but the recent shutdown over the zero COVID policy. So first, COVID led to a shortage of labor, low productivity, and the lack of free movement in commodities. Then with COP26 and the fossil fuel hysteria and the rise in prices of battery metals led to incredibly high volatility. We have seen commodity prices literally quadruple overnight, so much so that the nickel market was shut down by the London Metal Exchange when recently it went from about $23,000 per ton to $101,000 overnight. And that kind of volatility is being echoed elsewhere. We saw the Australian electricity market shut last week. We've seen the price of electricity in the Nordic countries go from $13 per megawatt hour to well over €200 pretty much overnight. So we've seen huge volatility in these markets. To illustrate really that this is a global phenomenon, one need look no further, I think, than the shipping markets, where the price of chartering a ship has skyrocketed and huge queues have developed outside many of the major Chinese ports such as Qingdao, Dalian, Shanghai, along with other ports like Singapore, Long Beach, California, New Orleans, Rotterdam, and Dubai, where literally thousands of ships are waiting in what are called the roads outside the harbor to be let in to offload. And this clogging of fully laden ships has slowed the global supply chain. We've seen incidents like the grounding of the ship in the Suez Canal and a similar grounding of a ship in the Panama Canal, literally bringing the global supply chain to its knees, or very nearly so. One of the elements of this is that just-in-time procurement, where companies just buy what they need, is no longer assured, and they are buying stocks to hold on to them, particularly difficult in the current climate. all of these shortages are highly disruptive to the world economy, and we are seeing no end to the rise in prices. Ironically, one of the commodities that has skyrocketed in the last few weeks has been the coal market, the thermal coal market, largely because there's no question about it that many countries are going to fire up their fleet of coal-fired power stations because they have no alternative. And we saw 2 days ago Germany buying in huge quantities of coal to fire up their power stations. So these shortages are highly disruptive. Volatility in these markets is very dangerous because if it's left unmanaged, then people in the automotive industry, the aerospace industry, manufacturing industry lose their profit margins. So there's no question about it. Every aspect of the commodity markets are having a major impact on our living standards. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Rob. Right, I shall relieve you of the spotlight and bring in Hilary. So, great start there from Rob. Hilary, your take on things.
Thanks, Rob. So there is, I think, no doubt at all that incomes are not keeping up with prices, and in some respects that is a timing issue. So, for example, increases on public service benefits and pay and pensions often linked to previous September's CPI. Last September's CPI looks pretty puny when you compare it to current levels of inflation. April figures, so CPI 9%, CPIH, which government says is its preferred measure, 7.8%, RPI 13.1%, and pension and benefit increases 3.1%. The other figure that's really interesting here is average weekly earnings, AWE, somewhere between 4 and 7%. Lots of bonus effects coming in, as I think some employers try to resolve some of their staffing issues through bonuses rather than ongoing pay increases. So some of this is quite tricky to measure. But some people might have noted that the other index that has been receiving quite a lot of airtime recently is the producer input prices. They've just risen by 22.1%. So, you know, that's a lot more inflation still in the pipeline for some of the reasons that Robert's just been explaining. That's an all-time record increase driven by transport, metal, chemicals prices. So there's no real sign of inflation stopping. I thought it is worth just mentioning a couple of issues around measurement. So, as I say, CPI has become the headline rate that government measure. RPI, which I think many of us still think is in some ways a better measure, still exists now, but government is phasing it out by 2030, although it has been taken to judicial review on that. And AWE is really problematic because people may know that AWE is not measured by actual gathering of lots of data. It's used, it's put together using a sampling methodology. So taking samples from employers. Now, that's been quite difficult over the period since the pandemic as people have moved in and out of the labour force into furlough and out of furlough. So really big shifts in the labour, the whole of the labour market, which means that measuring increases overall has been quite difficult because you're not measuring the same thing from month to month. On the topic of indices, we've really seen the re-emergence of claims recently about the wage price spiral. So this is a theory that says that as prices rise, workers negotiate higher pay. That increases employer costs. They pass those increases on in their prices, and the spiral takes hold. People might remember that Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, warned that workers shouldn't be asking for big pay rises because that would fuel inflation. In fact, the empirical evidence for a wage price spiral has always been quite weak. Perhaps most hot off the press, there's been research recently commissioned by Unite the Union that indicated that the profits and profit margins of UK companies have risen significantly post-pandemic, while workers' earnings have fallen in real terms, and that means after allowing for inflation. They point to incidences of what's called profit gouging, which is where companies use the supply side problems to artificially inflate their prices by more than the rise in their inputs. And I think there's that, and that there's quite a lot of opportunistic repricing going on in markets. Some analysis from BlackRock indicates that actually, if you compare the labour costs per unit of output, those labour costs are actually lower now than pre-pandemic. So there's some fat in there, you know, to actually support pay rises. But of course, more widely, in reality, if employers responded to price increases by introducing innovations, introducing productivity efficiencies, that would of course fund wage rises. I know Phil's going to talk a bit more about productivity later, so I'll leave that there. The other thing that we've seen quite a lot of talk about is the idea of a return to the 1970s. And I thought it was worthwhile just commenting on what's very different now to the 1970s. So in the 1970s, half of the workforce were in trade unions. Now it's around about a quarter, but many of those are in the public service unions, so rather than in private sector employers. In fact, only around 13.7% of private sector employees are covered by CBAs, by collective bargaining agreements. And of course, not all of those will be union members. There's also quite a shift in the labour force. 14% of workers are now self-employed, and earn on average less than employees do. And where we have seen wage inflation recently, it's been highest in the areas where people are perhaps already paid higher wages, so particularly in professional services and financial services. So what's government doing? So government seems to be pinning its hopes on the idea of the Bank of England using its levers to control inflation, in particular by raising interest rates. My view is that that's a very weak instrument to use against inflation that's driven mainly by supply side problems. It's also worth noting that in the 1970s, interest rate rises had a really, really immediate impact on people with mortgages, because most people in those days had floating rate mortgages. Now around 74% of people are on fixed rate mortgages. 96% of recent borrowers chose fixed rates. So it's a blunter instrument to control demand through consumers. But rising interest rates will make it much harder for companies to rearrange credit or bank borrowing. And the rising interest rates could well drive many very indebted employers into insolvency. But government has been kind of, focusing on interest rates, and it's been very quiet about the other thing that I think has been a big driver of inflation. That's quantitative easing. These are the levers that the Bank of England used to flood the economy via the banks with cash, and that supported cheap and easy credit. The scale of quantitative easing has been really staggering. So this first happened in 2009 in the wake of the 2008 banking crisis. About 250 billion spent then on quantitative easing. We've had other waves of QE in 2012, 2014 to 16, 2016 to 20, and it's ratcheted up each time. So 300 billion, 350 billion, 450 billion. Following the pandemic in 2020, 900 billion is what was spent on QE. Now, I'm not a kind of ardent monetarist, but I think it's important to note that mass of cash washing through the economy has not particularly been used productively. It's been used to inflate the value of shares. It's been used to fund some of the things that Robert was talking about, like cheap borrowing and companies doing things like share buybacks. Now, the Bank of England has started unwinding QE through quantitative tightening, QT. But it's doing that very, very, very slowly. It's not actually it's not actually sold any of its stock, but it is not renewing bonds as they mature. Lots of other levers government could be pulling that perhaps it isn't. Things like green levies on energy, VAT, the indirect effect it could have on transport and utilities costs, the direct effect it could have on things like interest on student loans, and tax and NI policy. We know that government has taken some action on things like benefits. So there's the cost of living payment, the rise in universal support, the discount on energy bills that's no longer a loan. But it does seem that there are bigger, perhaps more aspirational things that government could do that perhaps would have more longer term impacts. And I think that's where we perhaps need to be holding government to account, and where perhaps we could discuss more in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Again, very useful survey of some important issues. Right now, and finally, Phil.
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good evening all. Now, following on from those excellent points made by Robert and Hilary, I'm going to focus on three questions. First, why have the recent shocks of the pandemic lockdowns and the war in Ukraine had such a damaging impact for so many families in Britain? Second, where does prime domestic responsibility lie? And third, what could be done here to address these sharply rising prices? Now, I think answering the first question of why things are so bad for people is foundational to everything else, because misdiagnosis not only prolongs people's financial plight, but could well worsen it into the future. And unfortunately, too much of today's discussion from economists, from journalists, politicians, I think is misdiagnosing what's happening. In particular, it suffers from an overdose of presentism, by which commentators tend to privilege the observed present over the experience of the past. And that's a problem, because what has gone before is crucial to understanding today's economic challenges, and therefore for being able to come up with meaningful solutions. Specifically, while the supply shocks of the past 2 years have been substantial, and still, I think, have some way to run, as Robert has alluded to, the crucial truth exposed by the grave impact of these shocks is not about the present, but is about the pre-existing depth of economic malaise. And today's hardships will be another missed opportunity if we don't also address the revealed fragility of economic growth that prevailed long before the recent price hikes. And in this regard, I think both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor's reiterations that Britain's, quote, economic fundamentals remain strong are, to put it politely, at the extreme end of delusional presentism. Now, taking Hilary's example, focusing, if we were to only focus on today's price rises, or to raise fears about an illusory wage price inflationary spiral, that would divert, I think, from the essential reason why so many people have been pushed over the edge, which is that they don't have sufficient income, nor the cushion from previous income that could have helped tide them over through these price shocks. And this isn't just because, as Hilary has described, because real incomes, both wages and benefits, have been falling in recent months. It's because average real wages have been flatlining for around 15 years, and indeed are still below where they were before the financial crisis. As a result, many households entered this explosion of price surges with inadequate incomes and with minimal, if any, savings, and already in debt. In short, most people have insufficient slack or reserve to mitigate today's financial shocks. So the primary answer for why things are so bad for people is to see it, I think, as the cumulative result of decades of slowing personal income growth, going back half a century, in fact, to those famous 1970s, and to the start of an evolving long depression. Because the 70s was when wage growth began its gradual descent to zero over the last 15 years, driven primarily by the accompanying secular declines in business investment, in technology and innovation, and the resulting slump in productivity growth. that productivity being the amount workers were able to produce in the same time. As Robert described, even if high inflation subsides, we're likely to be left with the burden of elevated energy and some other commodity prices for some time. So the durable solution to a prolonged squeeze in living standards is to revive business investment and flourishing productivity. These are the only means for creating enough well-paying jobs for people and enabling sustained wage growth. In short, we need to restructure the economy so that it can give us real wage increases, not the wage cuts that policymakers are today trying to enforce. This takes us to the second question of where does prime responsibility rest at home? Again, I think the presentist commentary is deluding in the way that it has targeted blame on recent policy actions of the central banks, here as well in the US and Europe. The common criticism is that central bankers were complacent last year about the return of inflation and were, as the term is used, behind the curve in raising interest rates, thereby allowing inflation to become entrenched. I think this narrative is flawed for a whole number of reasons, not least because the presentist focus distracts from the much more damaging longer-term consequences of easier monetary policies that go back to the late 1980s, consequences which Hillary pointed out and described. Because the 1980s, the late 80s, was when Western central banks, with the backings of their governments, began to introduce ever looser monetary conditions which facilitated an easier resort to debt. And it's this state-led financialization and borrowing which helped paper over and evade those long-running productivity declines by enabling companies, individuals, and governments, in effect, to spend more than was being produced, and in the process generating the onerous debts, financial bubbles, and other instabilities of today. A more pressing political reason that scapegoating central bankers is misplaced is that, very conveniently for politicians, it takes the responsibility away from Western governments for having aggravated the productive slump and for its own long-running policy failures. Now, we all know about the devastating deindustrialization from the late 1970s and into the 80s, but much more importantly, for levels of prosperity today, we have had far too little reindustrialization in the subsequent decades in order to create replacement, higher productivity businesses, sectors, and jobs. Now that reindustrialization is a duty for governments to lead on, not for central banks, who, as Hillary said, can manipulate financial prices, but have next to no capacity to affect growth and productivity outcomes. And yet, since the late 1980s, successive governments have been hiding behind the fatalist and self-fulfilling claim that there is little that they could do economically in the face of global and natural forces. And instead, they delegated the technocratic management of the economy to their supposedly expert, independent, and unaccountable central banks. Now, this brings me to my third question. If the politicians have been failing their economic responsibilities, what could they be doing differently now? Now, I think given the extent of the hardship people are facing, the government needs to be, and this might be a utopian wish, but it needs to be able to do two things at the same time. It speedily has to help the people most in financial distress, while simultaneously, not later, but simultaneously launching a nationwide public deliberation about a productivity growth plan to boost people's future incomes. For the immediate task, as well as I think renouncing very firmly their backing for wage cuts, the cabinet should end this financial purgatory of lower income people waiting for more handouts and straight away implement something like the proposals from the Resolution Foundation think tank for, and Hillary was alluding to this as well, for upgrading this year's benefit payments in line with current inflation rates, not the outdated 3% inflation rate from last September. And in addition, I think they should restore that extra £1,000 annual lump sum on universal credit that was introduced during the lockdowns, but was withdrawn last October. Now, such unemployment and welfare benefit increases should be permanent, not temporary emergency measures, because we need them also in order to pursue the longer term productivity plan which, given the scale of sclerosis that is being exposed, is bound to be extremely disruptive to many of us during the gradual transition to the creation of better jobs. I think a core principle of this productivity program is to change existing policies so that they no longer block, but instead enable the creative destruction process. And this policy review should cover all areas: industrial, regulatory, energy production, transport, housing, as well as traditional fiscal and monetary policies. A return to creative destruction requires governments stopping the corporate welfare mollycoddling practices, not least those sustained negative real interest rates, because far from encouraging business investment, they've been propping up unproductive firms and thereby discouraging investment by the stronger ones. The plan also needs spending more public funds to promote innovation and invention, to back the development of new industrial and service sectors, deploying better technologies, including energy policies that can bring about cheap and reliable energy, as well as a house building program that supports cheaper accommodation and easier worker mobility. So in summary, governments should be pushed through the circumstance of this crisis to stop opposing wage increases and instead provide a triple package of measures that respond both to today's income squeeze as well as the need for wider economic restructuring. First, more generous financial support for people who can't get good jobs. Second, removing state-created barriers to business investment and innovation. And third, directing government intervention to be pursued through local, people-led transformation plans that support house building, new businesses, new industries, new sectors, including that cheaper, reliable energy network. If this doesn't happen, this crisis would unfortunately be another missed opportunity, and today's crunch in living standards will extend and worsen into the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Phil. So there's been a lot covered in those three presentations. They're all excellent and all covering different ground as well. So I'd be very keen to get your thoughts, questions, comments now as well. If your questions are more basic than perhaps has been covered in the presentations, please do feel free to ask quite basic questions or make more straightforward comments, because other people will be thinking much the same as well. So it would be great to have those comments as well. But also, please air disagreements as well. So we've got Thomas McEwen. So Thomas.
It's Simon.
Oh, hiya.
Hi. Thanks. They were three brilliant introductions. So I've just got a basic question for Phil, really. And I agree, but I just would like to know your answer. You say that more public funds for welfare, increased welfare, restoring the £1,000 a year benefit, etc., and then more public funds on housing, R&D. And there's a simple question: where would government get the money from? Would it borrow or increase taxes?
Okay, is that it, or is there?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was it. Yeah. That's great. Thank you very much. Yes, that is a perennial discussion, and particularly when we've been talking about the Bank of England providing lots of extra funds. Sorry, I'm going to spotlight myself again. Lots of extra money through quantitative easing. Where is this extra cash going to come from? Kerry Dingle.
Unmute. Hello, am I there? I think so. Very basic question. Thank you to Robert, Hilary and Phil. That was really, really helpful. The main thing that I get thrown at me all the time, like everybody, is avoids any responsibility being taken by Western governments whatsoever, which seems to be really key. But I also wonder if you could give us your insight. I know it's been mentioned, but to what effect did the shutdown, lockdown, and the prolonged variety in China, etc., even worse than what we had, and the war in Ukraine, because the lockdown and shutdown is entirely missed out of everybody's assessment, because that involves government taking responsibility. Everybody points to the war in Ukraine as being entirely responsible, which is one of Phil's key misdiagnosis. And everybody now, not everybody, but a huge number of people seem to blame workers wanting higher wages as hugely problematic, the wage price spiral. The wage price spiral seems to be the easiest one to just knock on the head. And for a lot of people, obviously, that's like, well, you know, screw you. And they tend to just point to the hypocrisy of everybody to justify it. But I do wonder what the real impact of the war in Ukraine is, and also what your assessment of the shutdown is. You know, I know what you've talked about, Phil, in terms of it being, you know, pre-COVID and sort of long-standing economic stagnation. But, you know, shouldn't we point a finger at governments for massive economic mismanagement as well as ending our political liberties?
Okay, great, thank you. Any more from the floor? Oh, sorry. No. Is there any? Yes, so Ian's asking about, is there any appetite amongst ordinary local populations for transformation plans? And shouldn't we be looking at these things nationally rather than locally? Good question. Jenny Cunningham.
Hi, am I unmuted?
You are.
Good. Again, quite a basic sort of question. Looking again at the whole productivity discussion, well, there doesn't seem to be a discussion about productivity that I can pick up. And this seems to be a complete avoidance of, you know, what is required, in fact, now, because it's obviously integrally related to, you know, propping up basically moribund industries and businesses. But there doesn't seem to be any discussion other than people occasionally fling out a bit of R&D. But I'm just wondering whether any serious economists are coming forward with any kind of strategy in terms of actually improving productivity, other than, you know, attacking workers' working conditions. Thanks.
Thanks. Mark.
Hello. Sorry about that. Sorry, microphone issue. Yeah, it follows on from the question on appetite for growth. Both house building came up in a couple of the introductions, and I say James Hartfield's written an interesting article on Spike today. But when government policy is about net zero and sustainability, it's sustainable development, and the planners have restrictions that are going unchallenged because no one's making a case for growth in the construction industry, as far as I can see. I don't think it's really in the interest of developers or house builders, because they want to build minimum houses so that they keep the values high. But yeah, it's that in the construction industry, I don't see any real appetite for growth. There's lots of people interested in nice new buildings and stadiums. There's another theatre in Manchester being built, but not any great appetite for growth big time with big housing building programs. Thank you.
Thanks. Para. Sorry, I'll get you to unmute. Does that work? Yes, you're on.
Does it work?
Yes, it has.
Okay, I've got a question and a quick comment. I'll start with the question. I mean, Kerry talked about the lockdown and the war in Ukraine. Something else I've begun to pick up in some of the articles that I read is that some commentators, certainly even economists, seem to bring Brexit into the discussion. And I think it would be useful to see what the panel thinks. Could it be Brexit as being the reason why we are where we are today? So that's the question. A very quick comment on, and Hilary mentioned this briefly about the disputes that we're having and the whole question of going back to the 70s. I think one thing, certainly, there are definitely labour disputes, certainly in the last 6 months. They've been dotted around the country. Apparently 10 organisations in Scotland have got people in dispute. In London, there's 22, Southwest, there's 14 organisations. So you could actually say there's plenty of discontent. And I would think that as inflation rises and wages do not keep up, which they're not at the moment, more people will strike. But I think that potentially, there's been articles about whether or not we're now workers are a lot stronger. Is there class? Could we go back to the 70s? I think it's a little bit far-fetched, because I think what did happen in the 70s and the 80s was that, the working class, its organizations were smashed. And what today, and COVID definitely has exacerbated this, is there's much more atomization and individuation. Hilary again mentioned that, when you look at the workforce covered by collective bargaining, today it is very, very low. It was about 80% of the workforce in the past. And now, my figure was nearer 20. Hilary said 13%. So it's even worse with a very weak workforce. And I personally find it difficult to see how, lots of disputes, but how could it be nationally organized and powerful will come into fruition? Just can't see it. And certainly in the past, in the 70s, the question was who rules, workers or government, or unions or government? I don't think we could ask that. That definitely is not on the agenda.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to take Howellis. Oh, sorry, and then Alan Miller, and then I'm going to bring the panel back in reverse order, just because there's so much on the table already that it's going to be tricky for the panel to respond just with what we've already started to talk about. So Howellis, and then Alan.
It's Marilyn, actually.
Right.
What I was going to say is, because obviously going back to the strike thing, and I do think it's interesting that we do seem to be getting a lot of adverts for unions. So obviously, I think there is so much dissatisfaction out there, and we say about the spiral of increasing wages. But I did hear it mooted yesterday that why don't the companies who have big profits, or just profits anyway, just give their workers a rise? And then they don't have to pass on the rise of the products to the people. Just if you see what I'm saying, so that everybody wins then. And even if you're not in a company that is a big company and you haven't got the same power as the bigger companies, then they won't have the price passed down onto them either. So isn't it a win-win-win situation that even if it's only a short-term thing, that they don't, that they give the profits more to as a pay rise, even if it's only short-term, but just to, it just seems immoral to me for all these companies still to be making big money when there's people down there that can't eat or have to choose between eating or heating. Just a thought.
Okay, thank you. Right, Alan.
Thanks. Great introductions. Thank you. It strikes me that one of the problems is that, as well as the presentism that you described, Phil, that there's either people say that people should get some more wages, or they say they're being irresponsible for the wages and we should just have cuts, maybe in green taxes or duties, or there's a critique of the public sector And then there's sort of ambivalence about the wages. It's more about the political agenda of the public sector. Look at all the private people that have lost their jobs in the private sector and their businesses. That alongside a really lack of ambition, because your proposals, and I know you said they might be somewhat optimistic and maybe not as realistic, but really what you're putting forward, and I agree with you, but what you're putting forward is a rethinking entirely and an entirely new orientation towards dynamism, transformative investment, innovation, and courage at a juncture, which this would be a perfect opportunity in some ways to do it, obviously in the middle of a crisis deepening, but at the very moment where our appetite for risk and courage has been really diminished. And I suppose you can assert something at the level of ideas and try and inspire people around it and say, look, rather than saying just have cuts or just, having wage, but, there's an argument for a bit more all-round sort of solidarity, that we're all in this together, we can work things out, but we need to have both the state and business and workers all having solutions together. But that thing where we say, take risks and be bold, I think it, obviously, any idea, you'd need to go out and promote it and try and champion it. But how realistic do you and everyone else think that really is? I mean, I'm all for it, but my conversations with people have been very frustrating because it's kind of very piecemeal. And when you try and assert the idea that we can have an all-round solution and that just, we should support people wanting wages, even if there's issues with the way the public sector has done things, but that isn't the solution in and of itself. We need to transform things. People just think it's all too daunting and all too much. And where the public is within all of this and making that demand to elected representatives and others.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So I'll bring the panel back in reverse order. So Phil, then Hilary, then Rob. But obviously, feel free, you can go beyond whatever your initial comments were and take up anything that's come up from the audience. So Phil.
Thanks. Alan, my point about might be a bit utopian, was supposed to be a joke, really. I was making the point that governments can't even do one thing, but I'm asking them to do two things at the same time. But I think it's quite realistic to expect us as people to be able to do two things at the same time, to both be fighting for wage increases and dealing with the problems of the present, but also to begin to discuss what the longer term solution is. So I don't see these as in any way counterposed. And in fact, I think they sort of reinforce each other. I think, what's going on at the moment with the rail strikes and other potential strikes in workplaces across the country, I think are very positive developments, because it shows people are prepared to take matters into their own hands. But in the course of that, we know that those things will be quite limited in and of themselves if they're restricted just to, trying to get a pay increase, which is a bit closer to inflation or at the same level. So I think we and others have a responsibility to try to, what you could say is establish a political discourse around that as to what the bigger picture is. And that's what I was trying to do, and saying that one of the most important things, when I was saying, for example, it's wrong to scapegoat the central bankers, is I think one of the things that comes out of this in terms of the discussion should be to not let the government, our political representatives, evade responsibility. People are knocking the government for all sorts of things at the moment, but as Jenny said, there isn't much of a public discussion about a productivity plan, whereas that's really at the source of a lot of the economic problems. So using today's discussion in ways which do not allow the government to pass off responsibility is, I think, very important. So that leads me just to take up just one other question, which is Kerry's question about how much responsibility applies to the lockdowns, how much economic responsibility applies to the war and so on in Ukraine. And I think it's very important at the moment, while in a sense being able to separate out the economic reasons for things from those broader questions of what stance do we take on the lockdowns or what stance to take on the war? And that's not just because it's important, I think, to be fighting openly for, you know, freedom and democratic rights and sovereignty, which are the issues which are highlighted by first the lockdowns in terms of illiberalism and in terms of the war in Ukraine, the fight for national sovereignty, but also because if these sort of external events are allowed to be used, which this government is using, it's not the case to say that no one is talking about the impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns. Read what governments are saying, what economists are saying. They're saying, oh, the problems we have are these supply chain disruptions. Or if you look at the war, as I think Boris said yesterday, you know, this war will cause inflation, cause all sorts of difficulties and thinks it's worthwhile. But that means that the political discussion about the economy gets passed off onto these endogenous sort of shocks from outside, and that avoids where the responsibility should be, which is this government has avoided having that discussion about productivity for years and years and years. This is not something which, you know, has just arisen in the last couple of years, but what I think this particular circumstance of today, the specificity of today, is that, and it's expressed in people fighting for higher wages, is that people are, in a sense, open, or there's a possibility of us taking the opportunity to situate today in what went before in terms of the failures of the policy in the past. And for as long as politicians are able to evade the responsibility, whether it's to central bankers or whether it's to say it's all down to the pandemic and the supply chain disruptions and problems of dislocation, or it's all down to you know, a war which we have to support, it's all passing responsibility away. Whereas the debate we need is a debate which is about domestic possibilities, and that is what I think is most important to draw out of all this.
Hilary.
Yeah, so to pick up on some of the questions that Ian and Mark and Alan were asking, I think one of the things that's quite important to do is to raise people's aspirations. You know, so rather than talking about, you know, let's build some new houses, why we're not talking about let's build some new towns, you know, perhaps centered around new technologies, you know, let's build a new biotechnology town and you know, bring the universities into helping with that, and you know, that kind of a public-private partnership to build those kind of things, not in a kind of profit-seeking way, but almost in a kind of you know, an innovation-seeking way. And actually, I think on, you know, Simon's question, where does the money come from? There is cash swirling about that needs investment. So for that kind of long-term investment, you know, if you think about all those people who are millions of people now auto-enrolled into pensions, you know, there's a massive stack of money there that the insurers are holding, and they're looking for long-term infrastructure type projects to invest it in. So I don't think money, you know, the investment money to do that is lacking. It's there and available, but what is lacking is the innovation and the aspiration, as Alan said, the courage and risk aversion is the things that we've got to really tackle. I'm not quite sure how, so perhaps more discussion on that. Kerry's question about how much is it the pandemic, I do still think that we've got to have a real discussion, a bit of a grown-up discussion about this great resignation, because and you know, people's ideas that they're going to carry on working from home forever, because I think some of those things are quite pie in the sky, and you know, one of the things I think we're going to see as the cost of living crisis bites is that some people will re-examine that there is a massive workforce shortage, and it's not just Brexit. On Paris' question, you know, it is that people have kind of phased out of the workforce, and re-engaging those people will be an important part of the work we do, I think, over the next few years. Going on to the kind of Jenny and Para and Marilyn's questions about productivity and unions and strikes, I think, I mean, Para's right that the unions were smashed, and you know, from one level, from the point of view of capital, that's really a good thing in terms of employers. But you know, it does mean that all the things that workers did, that you know, in their collective organisations of unions, has been lost. So if you do remember the 70s, you know, when there were strikes, the discussions were along the lines of, we want a 14% pay rise. And management would say, well, what productivity gains can you help us with? And, unions are a key driver of improving those productivity levels. And all that's been lost. And actually, I think we all know that it's workers on the ground who are probably best at finding the real problems with the way work works at the moment and addressing those problems. But that ability for management and workers to talk and work together to improve those things has been lost by the unions being smashed. And actually, I think there are some nice green shoots coming through now that perhaps indicate that some of those the ways in which people could work together to drive society forward are being rebuilt. I don't want to get too romantic about that. There's still that big tension between the owners of capital and workers, and that's not resolved by people working together to address some of those things. So on Marilyn's point, going back to a kind of Marxist analysis of society, there are the owners of capital and the workers, and the owners of capital don't give money away. Workers have to fight for that, and we have to try to reinvent ways to do that, because they won't just do it because of the need for workers to have a kind of sympathy vote. There was one other thing. Yes, so people might have seen the doctors today. Doctors are asking for a 30% pay rise, being nice and starting nice and low in their aspirations there. And I do think public service discontent might look a bit more 70s like, if I'm honest, because I think some of those structures still exist there. And I think when we've been talking about strikes so far, I think we have been talking largely about it in the private sector, and I think public sectors it is quite different, and we will see quite a lot of discontent in that area.
Brilliant. And Robert.
Just a quick comment following the question about Brexit that was raised by Para. There is a fad at the moment, particularly amongst ex-Tory grandees like Michael Heseltine, Rory Stewart, and more recently Sadiq Khan, throwing in their 5 pence worth on blaming it all on Brexit. I'm not arguing for a moment that there aren't serious issues in not only the British economy as raised by both Hilary and Phil, but I think one does have to situate a lot of this as a global issue. If you go to look at the labor market in Germany at the moment, there is a huge pool of a shortage of labor. There's a shortage of labor in Italy, in Spain, in France, and in the United States. So it's not a Brexit issue. It's a fundamental issue about the world economy at the moment and the impact that these commodity prices have had on that, but also the lack of policy responses that we're seeing from all of those governments as to what they should be doing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think that might be worth pursuing. I mean, why isn't these labour shortages converting into productivity gains? That's obviously could be a bit of a long-term issue. So thank you for your patience, those of you who've been waiting to speak. Next up is Daniel Ben-Ami.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. 2 quick things. First of all, it seems to me the big political challenge, and I don't have an answer to this myself, is to develop a framework to kind of repose this question, to say it may seem like a cost of living crisis, and in many ways it is, but there's something more fundamental going on. So in other words, to link what Hilary and Rob said, where they very clearly explain how people's cost of living is being squeezed, to what Phil said, who explained that it is fundamentally about productivity and about economic growth and about other things, because it seems to me the idea of a cost of living crisis has real purchase on people, because people's real wages and real living standards are falling. It's not a kind of myth, it's not made up. But to explain that fundamentally there are other forces at work It's not a one-off shock, as Phil was saying. It's not the result of a one-off shock like the war in the Ukraine or the pandemic, but it is part of a longer-term crisis. It's very, very difficult. Not impossible, but to some, and so we can develop a political program about what should be done, and I think that's completely legitimate to do that. But I think we need to think more about how to reframe it and repose it in a different way to try to explain to people what the underlying forces are. I mean, I know, for example, that Kerry is very good at this kind of thing. Kerry, who I know claims no great economic expertise, but just to try and capture people's imagination, to try to explain that there are other drivers to what's going on, rather than just the one-off shocks, which is what people relate to. Secondly, very quickly, I think it's a pity no one so far has said anything about food, because it is, well, people talk about energy, but food prices as well are the main drivers of inflation at the moment, or the main elements of rising inflation. So when we talk about whatever the figure is, say 10% inflation, that rate is actually going to be higher for poor people than for rich people, because poor people, unfortunately, can't afford to go to the theatre very much or to go on foreign holidays. So poor people are going to be harder hit by this cost of living crisis, which is a real problem. And also, I mean, we focused on Britain in this discussion, which is completely legitimate to do, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that also poor countries will be hit harder, partly because they're more heavily dependent on food. So that creates the basis for instability in these poorer countries as well. It doesn't mean there'll automatically be revolutions or political radicalism or anything, but the people at the bottom of society are going to be harder hit, much harder hit than the average person, both in Britain and also that applies to countries internationally.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for raising all those things. I'll take Linda next, and then it'll be James Woodhousen.
It's just two things. The first thing is, if I was a real cynic, I would say what cost of living crisis, because you've got millions of jobs lying empty, and you've got 1.3 million more people claiming benefits or not claiming benefits, but not in the labour market than there were before the pandemic. That's able-bodied people who could be working of beneath retirement age, who have chosen one way or another not to participate in the labour market, which is dying and crying out for workers. So it seems to me a bit, there's a bit of an irony or a bit of a conundrum there that we have to be able to explain in terms of this question of evasion, this question of lack of aspiration. Some people are talking about how workers are going to strike for higher wages. That may well be true, but on the other hand, we've got people threatening to strike because they don't want to work anymore, like the doctors today, who basically are too burned out to work on a Saturday. So is it just the case, as Phil was pointing out, that what we need to do is provide better paid jobs so that people will want to work? Or is there something else that we need to be doing to address that question? The other point I want to make is that I think Hilary raised earlier around how capital works, and I think capital doesn't work the way we used to understand it, in that it doesn't want to necessarily accumulate the way it used to, because it's handed out billions in furlough, billions in handouts. Only today we had the Welsh Prime Minister talking about how he's going to hand out millions and millions of pounds to young people in a UBI experiment. So it seems to me that the capitalist class would much rather evade the problem of making painful decisions by completely changing how capital actually works here. And I know some people have framed it in terms of pushing social responsibility away, but I think what's important to do is try and explain this evasion, this aspiration, in terms of them not wanting to, in terms of how that works in terms of capital accumulation. Just to...
Great, that's a really important question. James Woodhousen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, has stressed is that unemployment is surprisingly low. And of course, we know that there's, to take up previous points, 5 million, I believe, not available to work, 5 million altogether. So that may explain some of it, but it is an interesting feature of the economy, which I think perhaps Hilary and Phil would comment upon, that unemployment remains low. And for how long do they think it will be low? Is another question related to that. I fully agree with Phil that to scapegoat people like Bailey or Christine Lagarde or whoever it is, Powell and the Fed, as responsible for our inflationary woes, is part of that pattern of evasion that governments do, and gets them off the hook. I think that it is, as part of Phil's program for economic revival, I think we must raise the demand to abolish the ability of, nevertheless, although it's wrong to scapegoat them, central bankers or our central banker should not be, as he is unelected, in charge of the blunt instrument to which Hilary refers. It is only a blunt instrument, but it does set mortgage rates, I believe, and not just interest rates. And if you look at its remit now, I've just been working on this, it's important for take seriously climate resilience, financial literacy among school children, and all kinds of woke diversions, chiefly to do with diversity and inclusion, for all the firms that it regulates. Therefore, although its influence isn't the vulgar, enormous sort that is wielded by the Monetary Policy Committee, or thought to be the main event, as colleagues have said, I think reform of these central banks, and to get the responsibility back in the hands of government, not unelected technocrats who actually take lots of political views, is something that we should also call for as part of Phil's restoration.
Okay, there's not a lot of hands up at the moment, but that's fine. But so I want to come back to the panel for anything else. I mean, I wanted specifically to ask Robert about, because you said in relation to commodities, for example, that there wasn't much of an appetite for risky investment. But one of the things that's constantly in the things that I read around commodities, we've got loads of the stuff, so we just we can just dig it out of the ground. But that's obviously not happening. So what is it that could make people invest, or companies invest in drilling for oil or mining or whatever it is, or making these investments that's going to really transform things? Because I mean, and are those the same kind of barriers that we're seeing at a domestic level? So that's for you. But then Hilary and Phil, anything that you want to say, and then I'll come out for a final round of comments from the audience. So Robert.
Okay, thanks, Rob. I just wanted to come back on a couple of things. Daniel's comment about food prices is extremely apposite, because although it is affecting us in terms of price rises at the supermarkets, there are countries that are in absolute dire straits at the moment. There's a serious risk of famine in the Sahel, in Egypt. Egypt is almost entirely reliant on Ukrainian wheat, and these will have knock-on effects for years to come. We're also likely to see energy shutdowns over the winter that will affect the old and infirm and young. So, yes, these do have real consequences. going to Rob's point, I think surety of a return on investment is what would make mining companies more interested in investing in many economies. We have seen some serious collapses almost into failed state areas like New Caledonia, Tanzania, where the demands that are made by the government or by the central banks are so onerous that mining in many countries would just not be profitable. The new mining charter in Peru, the new mining charter in Chile, in many other countries is so onerous that countries are pulling out. So we've just seen Glencore pull out of Zambia, we've seen Vedanta pull out of Zambia, and joyfully the government has nationalized some of the mines involved there, which I think is a very dangerous situation to be in because they don't have the wherewithal or the capital to mine those areas. So surety of investment, surety of taxation levels, surety in terms of royalties that they have to pay, and you know, there are numerous other factors, but stability is key to any new investment. Given its longevity, given that it takes a long time for these projects to get on stream, nobody's going to invest in most of these economies at the moment.
Thank you very much, Robert. Hilary, any things that you want to come back on?
Yeah, I just wanted to perhaps not give an answer, but explore a bit more Linda's challenge that actually capitalism's changed. It doesn't work in the same way that it does, because I think that's a good challenge, both in the terms that she phrased it, but also in terms of kind of following on from the question Robert's just been grappling with. You know, what are the responsibilities of company management today? Because, you know, at one point the responsibility of a company's board to its shareholders would have been to increase profit. You know, and now that's probably still on your list, just about. But you've got all these other things on your list, like, you know, ESG and D&I and your commitment to the environment and all those kind of things. And it does seem that those are all things that are unhelpful to trying to push a growth agenda. I think Daniel's just put something in the chat about being a bit careful about not saying that companies are anti-growth, because people are not anti-growth, but they are required. It's not necessarily coming from them. They are required by external forces to also think about lots of other things that actually are not to do with, you know, capital as we might have traditionally phrased it, and the profit motive as we might traditionally have phrased it. So I think, you know, we do need to think about how do we, which of those things are useful and which of those things are not useful, and how do we situate the kind of question that Daniel was posing. You know, how do we reframe all this discussion? How do we reframe it, allowing also for those kind of challenges? Just on Linda's other point, which was around, you know, and James mentioned it as well, we've got, you know, these millions of people who are not working anymore, and for whom it's, you know, you're kind of scratching your head saying, well, you know, why is the cost of living crisis not affecting these people? Yes, and I do think partly there's a bit of a catch up, and some of those people will have a little bit of a reserve, and once that gets eaten up, it will be problematic. We do need to remember that even if inflation goes away, current high prices won't go away. So, you know, if inflation falls to zero tomorrow, it still means that your energy prices are a lot higher than they were a year ago, because it's just that they haven't gone up anymore. And you know, so we do need to, you know, be cognizant of the fact that, you know, people will start feeling the pinch a bit more soon. And I think some of these things will take a little bit of time to play out. So I don't think we should necessarily make all our judgments based on what's happening today. You know, I think we do need to give things a little bit of time to work through.
Okay, great. Phil.
I stick to my critique of presentism, but just to clarify, this doesn't mean that everything's always the same. I mean, what we have some very different things going on at the moment, which we have to be able to incorporate. I think on the big picture side, I think what I was trying to stress was that these recent shocks that have hit not just the British economy, but the whole world economy, all the European economies, the American economy, and so on, that these shocks are important, not only in and of themselves, because clearly, you know, as people have explained, you know, what's happened in you know, the price of semiconductors or something and the price of cars is obviously linked to the lockdowns that there were, or what's happening to food prices is clearly linked to what's going on in terms of the war in Ukraine. These are real consequences, but I think the bigger picture is the way in which these shocks have revealed just how fragile the British economy is, but more broadly the whole Western economies are. That, and what that fragility is about is not just, you know, a cumulative effect. I mean, I described the way in which, you know, real wage growth has been, you know, edging down since the 70s. So, you know, real wages were growing by something like 3% in the 70s, pretty much the same in the 80s, then down to 1.5% in the 1990s. Then by the time we get to the financial crash, as I say, since then in Britain, it's been zero. So you can, you know, have a linear cumulative process, but I think more importantly, and superimposed on top of that, is that the various coping mechanisms which capitalism has deployed since the 70s are much weaker. They're sort of eroding. They're have been exposed to be more exhausted. Monetary policy is a classic example. That you know, there was this belief that if you manipulate money through monetary policy practices, namely most importantly interest rates, but as Hilary explained, quantitative easing, creating money, and so on, then that could somehow resolve the problems and stabilize things. And it did stabilize things for a period, and that's important. There was a common view between business, the central bankers, the politicians, that if we can, you know, stabilize things and just cover over the problems in a sense, that was great for everybody. Businesses could go on doing what they're doing, you know, and having share buybacks and not investing much, but, you know, having enough money to have a decent life if you're in the C-suite. Politicians could get on with doing nothing else but just sort of whatever else they wanted to be involved in, mainly the culture wars. The central bankers thought, oh well, we've got a role for ourselves, fine. But that that sort of form of coping, which people would call financialization, to give it a broad term, is now less able to stabilize things. That's what's been exposed. I mean, in the sense it was exposed by the 2008 crash, which was one limit, but they managed to patch things up again, and as Hilary described, pumped a lot more money over the last 12 years into the economy, which kept things going for a bit. And without the shocks of the lockdowns and without the shocks of the Ukraine war, maybe things would have been trudging along still in this sort of precarious sclerosis, where there's no productivity, there's no real wage growth, but the economy still keeps going. The importance of the shock is that it's exposed, the shocks, it exposed that those coping mechanisms are no longer as effective as they were. That's why there's such a focus on the central banks at the moment, not just because the governments want to pass responsibility off, but because here's another, you know, independent, expert, technocratic organization, which has supposedly been doing all these great things for 20 years, keeping inflation low, keeping everything stable, managing to keep house prices, you know, going up, etc., etc. You know, obviously keeping the rich people with shares been doing okay through this. Financial assets have been going up. The whole crypto market took off. All these things have been happening, but now the whole thing seems to be, you know, on an edge, because there's this dilemma that the central bankers for months didn't know what they could do. You know, it's not that they were complacent last year, it's that they have a sense from themselves that if they've created an economy which is reliant on negative interest rates, and the negative interest rates continue today, let's not forget, negative real interest rates. When you got inflation at 9% and interest rates are 1%, that's a negative 8% real interest rates. When you've got an economy which relies on that just to keep ticking over, then they realize they've got a big problem here. So they try and act big and say, well, we'll put interest rates up by, wow, an enormous 0.75% from the Fed. What an aggressive move. You know, it's just play acting in some ways, but they are sensitive that their credibility could be pulled apart in this, and this would be another great expert technocratic institution, falling into despair. So the point I want to end with here is I'm saying there are different things happening, but they're primarily to do with the exhaustion of the coping mechanisms. Because you could also talk about internationalization, talk about intensification of work, all these things which have been tried over the last and used effectively over the last 30, 40 years are reaching limits. Now, I'm not saying we're at the limit, because it's never a wise thing to speculate that capitalism has reached its limits of coping. But certainly there are many indicators from the debt mountains, from the problems of the monetary policies, from what's happening in terms of people, ordinary people saying, I'm not prepared to put up with this anymore. I may have tolerated 0 real wage increases for the last 15 years, but now I'm getting, 4 or 5% wage cuts in real terms, in the ways that we can all sense. Then you're coming up against those limits. And that's why it's a great opportunity, because it's exposing the problems of capitalism. It's a great opportunity to open up the political discussion, I'm saying.
Right, great. Okay, so I know that James Hartfield wants to speak, but if anybody else, even if you've spoken before, if you want to come back in and make a follow-up point or anything, then please do. So James. Oh, sorry, I think I need to ask you to unmute, sorry.
Hey, yeah, so, I mean, what if, let's try it the other way around. What if we don't need less presentism, but a bit more? I mean, instead of thinking, you can't see the wood for the trees, what about if you can't see the trees for the wood? I mean, to say that it's not so much like exogenous shocks. We talk about all these things as though they're exogenous shocks and somehow external to what's going on. What if they are actually manifestation of the problem? So, I mean, look, COVID-19 obviously was a real thing, a virus and all the rest of it. But in terms of the way the society coped with it, that was predisposed by a certain intellectual approach, moral approach and all the rest of it, which was, I would suggest, in the main destructive. And so, which is a worldwide event, which reached down deep into every aspect of every economy in the world. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that the things that happened in 2020 and 2021 have had some consequence for what's happening in 2022. So my thinking would be that, for example, if you say like coping mechanisms, I mean, the coping mechanisms wouldn't be working if the problem that they were coping with was not the same problem that they were coping with in the 1980s. And I'd like to suggest that at its root, what you've got is it's not really to do with the accumulation of capital or the barriers thereto or profit margins or anything like that. It's much more a kind of an embedded culture of hostility to production, and really a kind of subjective problem, except that it's manifested, that it's become institutionalized as a kind of excessive problematization of development and production. And this is a wholly new kind of a situation. So it would hardly be surprising if the coping mechanisms of the problems of the 1980s, which were rather different, didn't really work in 2020, would it? So my vision of it is, rather than seeing, say, like the housing crisis or the energy crisis, or the food problems that are going on, rather than seeing all these things as unconnected. What's happening in Sri Lanka, what's happening in Sahara, what's happening in Europe. Look, these things in North America, they're not unconnected. They're all manifestations fundamentally of a broadly similar problem, which is that societies doesn't have the moral resources to sustain itself, and rather than sort of like pushing that problem aside and saying these are not, these are external to the issue. They are the issue. They are the trees, which is the wood. I mean to say. So I would say that if you wanted to manifest a manifesto for change, that also means a kind of firefighting issue on in each and every one of these issues, and to draw out the sense in which they are the crucial, the problem that's posed, the question that's posed in each one is, do we make the investments we need to make ourselves secure and wealthy in the future and now, or do we mess the whole thing up yet more and run away from these problems? So I think these are the issue. All these different manifestations of the problem, they are the problem.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Marilyn, and then I'll just go back to the panel for their final thoughts. So, Marilyn.
I still can't. It's probably really simplistic, but I still don't understand how the oil industry and are still allowed, and or the energy companies are still allowed to make so much money, and so they're still reaping. In fact, they're getting richer because it wasn't the head of BP said it's like a cash machine, and it's not being passed down to us. I mean, surely that is not right. So, how I see it is that any tax on earnings or profit should be calculated on the ability to pay, as it is with PAYE. So all this talk of a windfall tax is like if someone happens to earn a bumper salary in any one given year, then they pay a higher rate of tax. And then if the next year the earnings drop for whatever reason, they'll pay a lower rate of tax. So I just can't get my head around the fact that companies like that are allowed to continue to get increased profit when it's not passed down, and that it should be being passed down to us, even if it's, as I said, even if it's only short term. I just don't get it. I just don't.
Okay, great. So, panel, your final takeaway, thoughts, etc. So, Robert, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I really, the thrust of what I'm arguing is that that this is a global phenomenon and that every country is facing the same issues, particularly when we're talking about the advanced economies, suffering from the same malaise that Phil is talking about, but exacerbated by events that often cannot be seen as entirely in their control. Commodity prices have been extremely volatile for a long time, and they've not been managed efficiently by either industry or governments, and they haven't, by and large, saved for a rainy day. So they, coming back to Marilyn's point, they are, going from one year to the next, either making a profit or making a loss. I'm not entirely sure that taxation is the issue here. I mean, I think it's one issue, but I think the key to this is that a stable investment environment where risks are managed efficiently, where resources that are made in good times are set aside for bad times or difficult times, is key to creating some kind of stability in the commodity markets. And it could be any commodity.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hilary.
Yeah, I'm just to pick up a final question Si was just thrown into the chat. I don't think there is a problem with companies and government not seeing productivity gains as a good thing. I think they do. But there are huge swathes of industry where improving productivity is really problematic. And they are the companies that Phil has referred to as the zombie companies that really need to go. And the problem that we have is that government, by and large, are not willing to kind of tackle that problem and to deal with the consequences of tackling that problem. You know, that's a bigger issue. It's not just a UK issue, it's a bigger issue, but it is an issue we have, I think, to a degree in the UK that is much higher than in some other countries. Just going back to some of the other points, I guess the thing that I'm trying to hold on to, because I think this has been probably quite a depressing discussion, and perhaps the thing I'm trying to hold on to as something, a kind of thing that perhaps might make us more optimistic, is the fact that to me this does make things a bit more black and white. So, you know, some of the points that Marilyn was making about, you know, some of this just feels quite unfair. I don't disagree with. The issue I think we have is that how do you challenge and channel that feeling of unfairness into something that really can be a way that we try to change politics and the future. And I do think the fact that workers will be more and more struggling with the issues of the cost of living crisis does mean that they will inevitably become more open to discussions about what the long-term solutions to their problems are. Again, I don't want to be romantic about this, because I think, you know, there's lots of conclusions they will cling on to that are not particularly positive or helpful or constructive. And that's why we do need some of these bigger debates that Phil has been hinting at to kind of really take root in society, so that people can grapple with and engage with those discussions, rather than going off on some of the tangents that we do see people going off at as we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. Finally, Phil.
Thanks, and thank you all for some very, very interesting questions. I'm just going to focus on James Hartfield's points, because I think they well, I should say it's probably me, I did get a bit confused as to what was a manifestation and what was the real problem and what was the wood and what was the trees, but that's just me being a bit slow. But overall, James, I think we can agree, and I think we are agreeing, that the problems, while they manifest themselves as economic problems, are not soluble within those narrow confines. What we're really talking about is a big cultural problem. I agree entirely with what you were saying on that. The issue is how, or one of the issues which we all need to think about, is how we take particular circumstances, like as Hilary was summing up, that think sometimes when the perceptions become a bit more, you said black and white, but they become a bit more clear as to what's going on. When that happens, it's an opportunity to begin to question some of the old ways of thinking. Daniel talked about reframing things or developing a framework. I think we have to understand, and I agree with him entirely on that, but we're starting from a framework which already exists, a framework of different ways of characterizing it, but I think James Hartfield would agree. It's one where there's a very strong fatalist frame of mind. And that's, I think, particularly evident within economic discussions. And that's why I've been, bending the stick on this point of presentism, because there is a cultural mindset which isn't just within the elite, but is held by many people, which is reflected in the economic discourse, that these economic problems are really natural problems. I mean, that's another side of what you were saying, James, in terms of the antipathy to production, the antipathy to even discussing things in the economy because they're natural and seen as outside us. And so we've had a whole series of fetishized concepts over the years, from globalization to technological change to demographic shifts and so on, where there's which are put forward as the determining factors behind world economic developments. And they resonate because there is that fatalist mindset that there's not much we can do about things. I think governments have got that to extreme. Businesses have got that as well, because they prefer a quiet life rather than or most of them, rather than to do a lot of innovation and creative destruction of their own. And a lot of people are infected by that same fatalism. So there's a susceptibility to those sort of arguments which attribute blame for things which are actually within our control, our collective control, to outside events, to globalization, whatever. And I'm saying that in the current context, while those discussions carry on, there's a number of other external events which are being used by the elite to avoid and evade having that discussion, which Jenny talked about right at the beginning in the discussion period, about the productivity problem. When productivity has been flatlining for 15 years, when we have real wages not going anywhere, which is, as many people will have read, the first time this has happened since the beginning, or since the early years of the Industrial Revolution, since the Napoleonic age. When you think society is not able to produce wealth, you'd think that would cause a bit of a discussion, but it isn't. And one of the ways that it isn't is because of the cultural hold of fatalism that allows those sense of malaise which people feel to be attributed to external events. And today those events could be Brexit, Brexit to blame, which we can all laugh about and stuff, but there is a concerted effort to try to say our problems are to do with that vote took place 6 years ago. And even though many of the people of the Brexit bashers are doing this to bash Boris Johnson at the moment and taking advantage of his local difficulties, the paradoxical impact of blaming Brexit for economic problems is that it lets this government, the Johnson government, off the hook for the fact that they've helped create and foster these problems. Similarly, these great world historic events, which were world historic, of the lockdowns imposed because of the pandemic, which was unjustified in the way it was extended and the illiberalism of it, or the historic event of the resistance of the Ukrainian people to fight for national sovereignty against Russia. Those are very, very important events, but they're being manipulated and used by sections of the elite to avoid having a discussion about the economy, to blame these external events and say, well, they're out of our control. Nothing that is, as I said, as Boris said yesterday, inflation will happen, nothing we can do about it, living standards will go down, but we've got to because of supporting Ukraine. I 100% agree with him. It's the best thing he's done in terms of supporting the Ukrainian people in the last few months. But I disagree with him of reinforcing this fatalist view that there's nothing we can do about our economic problems. There's nothing we can do about inflation. There's nothing we can do about cost of living crisis. It's just one of those things that happens because we've taken a stance on Ukraine, or we took a particular stance on pandemic, or we took that vote to leave the European Union and so on. No, we've got to challenge that. Part of the reframing things, Rob, to finish, part of the reframing things is to challenge each of those arguments which tries to shift responsibility away from what we can do collectively and what we can do through our elected representatives. And that's why I was stressing this thing, just to finish, of local discussion, not because we can have solutions on a local level, but I have faith but in terms of being able to flesh out this program of productivity change, it has to come from people on the ground who know what they're talking about. You know, whether they're trade unionists or just other people in a community which understands what the strengths and their strengths and weaknesses, understands what factories have closed down or what factories are on the edge or what workplaces are rubbish and so on. And they can be part of creating a transformation program, which will have to be, as Ian said, a national one, but it's not going to come top down from Westminster, just as none of their industrial strategies, which they've now abandoned, of course, you know, ever are minded to anything. It's got to come from the people we can really trust, which is ourselves.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for taking part in this and all the useful, interesting comments, but kind of particularly have a little round of applause for our speakers who have all been very, very interesting indeed. Right. Okay. So.